There's,
we're
Mr.
missing John.
It's just a mention.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second panel this morning. This panel is titled Hope in the Hills, Legal Aid of West Virginia's Strategic Response to Appalachia's Challenges. This panel will discuss legal aid of West Virginia's implementation of programs for responsive and strategic planning to better serve the people of West Virginia. It will also contribute to current data on what citizens of West Virginia perceive as their problems, and on what legal organization, in cooperation with the College of Law, is doing to address these concerns. I will turn it over to the moderator of the panel, Professor McDiarmid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I was looking over the schedule for the symposium, I noticed perhaps somewhat ironic fact that there were two panels that used the word hope in their title. Many of the panels here in the last couple of days have talked about hopeful initiatives, but there were only two that actually used that word. And the one that took place yesterday afternoon was a meeting of many of the most well-regarded, knowledgeable spokespeople in the legislature for interests that have been quite successful in the last couple of years. Folks who believe firmly that the way that this state's going to progress is by removing regulation and letting the free enterprise system run at full throttle. And those people do believe that in their gut. But they also, as a byproduct, represent the most well-off, the most moneyed part of our population. Many of those representatives come out of this College of Law, are recent grads, and are successful recent grads. Fast forward to today, and we're talking to a very different kind of audience and need. The hope here is for the poorest, the least enfranchised part of our population, because that's the population that's served by legal aid. And again, we have representatives from graduates from this college on this side of the panel as well. In the legislature in recent years, we've not fared quite as well as the folks who were represented on the first panel. And I would particularly draw to your attention a recent speech by, again, one of our College of Law grads, Chad Lovejoy, on the floor of the House, trying to beat back limitations on food stamp access with the argument that we have a duty to feed the poor. So we've got a real contrast in terms of the audience that we're addressing today. And I think you'll find this an interesting discussion, because it addresses so many of the needs of our poorest citizens. So what you'll hear this morning is a part of the strategic planning process that legal aid went through last year to try to figure out, we do this on a regular basis, as does every well-run organization, to try to figure out where we can best target limited resources. There are many more poor people in the state of West Virginia than legal aid can ever hope to serve, even legal aid in conjunction with all of our clinical programs can't hope to make a dent in the population that needs our services, and therefore deciding where to get the most bang for the buck is an important piece of the work of the staff of the program. This time we did it a little differently from what we've typically done in the past. We've always tried to survey client population, and frankly we've had various levels of success with reaching the people who are most directly affected by our services. So this year we decided to do some traveling outreach, to go around to all of the big population centers in this state and talk to community service providers, talk to healthcare people, talk to basically anybody who was willing to show up and talk to us about what their communities needed. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to first focus on that piece. And John Tull, who is an old friend of mine, and
emphasis on the old.
Definitely.
As well as friend.
For both. Emphasis on the old. Been working in legal services for 40 some odd years, and part of his work now is assisting other legal services programs in analyzing their needs and the needs of their community. So John's going to talk about the community listening sessions and the sort of overall arc of the strategic planning process. And then we're going to hear from Adrienne Worthy, who is the Executive Director of Legal Services here in West Virginia. Again, somebody who's worked in that field and worked both in legal services and in other service providers in the state for a long time, about the agency's response to the findings of the listening tour. And then we're going to hear specifically from a mix of the staff of legal aid, who are now targeting areas elicited from that tour. And in doing that, we will also talk about some of the cooperation that's going on between the various clinics up here at the law school and the legal services operation. So that's the overview. You can read everybody's credentials in the book. They're quite impressive. I'll get started with John.
So I have years of learning about technology from Marjorie. So what's the button I push here? The one in the middle?
No, the one in the middle actually is very, that's a pointer.
So which one?
The one on the left.
The left. Okay.
On the right.
I'm sorry, right.
Okay.
Okay.
So right. It worked. That's literally true. I did some work with Marjorie. We were a part of a thing called the Quality Consortium many years ago, which was a bunch of people in the legal aid world who cared about helping people work more effectively with the folks whom they were serving. And Marjorie was part of the Quality Consortium, and this was way before laptops or any such thing, and she always had some new technological gadget which worked wonderfully. And I would look at her and say, damn, I got to hang around with this woman. But here I am. Well, I'm really delighted to be back here. And when I say back here, I spent, it felt like a year, though I was just in and out, but a year really having the privilege of working on the process that we're going to talk about today, which is this community listening effort of Legal Aid of West Virginia as a part of their strategic planning process. And Marjorie's already sort of touched on this, but what Legal Aid of West Virginia hoped to accomplish is, as Marjorie said, they had for years. It's an excellent program and highly regarded across the country, and one of the reasons is because it's really focused on strategic planning over the years. A lot of nonprofit organizations, including legal aid organizations, do strategic planning, but frankly, a lot of times it's to create a little book that goes up on the shelf and satisfies their funders, and they can talk to their board about it, and occasionally send it off somewhere. But Legal Aid of West Virginia has been really serious about planning for purposes of really defining what they do, and it's an organization that really cares a lot about what they do. I sat in the previous session. I know in the back of the room it's very hard to see some of the lower stuff, and there may be a point when you want to stand up, just because part of this presentation is really going to be letting you hear what people in these community listening sessions talked about. And rather than read those to you, I've got them up on a slide, so when we get to there, it may just be easier to stand up for a minute. It won't take long. It'd also be a good way to get your blood going about 11:30 when everybody's getting ready for lunch. But typically, as Marjorie said, typically what legal aid organizations have done across the country when they're required by the federal funding, Legal Services Corporation, to do a needs assessment, and typically it's been, let's ask people if they think the work that we're doing matters. So they'll survey clients, they'll survey judges, they'll survey social service agencies, they'll survey the bar, and the question will be, should we continue to do eviction? Should we continue to do the same amount of domestic violence work? Should we continue to do collection practice? And when I first talked to Adrienne about their planning process, and she said, what I really want to do here is I really want to get this organization focused strategically on making a difference with core issues that affect the communities that we serve. And so we landed on this process, which was to not ask a question about what are the legal problems people have, but to go around the state and to really try to dive into the question of what affected people's lives. And Marjorie said we invited anybody who would come. That's actually not exactly accurate. We carefully selected the people that came and worked at it, because what we wanted to have was people who would come, who were working in agencies that were on the ground and working with, and it could be any number of people, from a social service agency to people in academia that study poverty issues, to teachers, to people from county health departments. And the criteria was that we wanted them to come and be prepared to sit down and discuss poverty with each other, and to answer two questions, which were, first, from their perspective, and this, we weren't asking them to make a presentation about their organization, we're asking them through the lens of their work to answer the question of what are the issues that they see, the problems that people with whom they work that cause crisis in their lives and threaten their survival. And it literally threatened people's survival, as you know. It's kind of it sounds like a bumper sticker, but for many people, a lot of the issues they confront are life and death issues and do involve survival. And then the second question we asked them to discuss is what stands in their way of escaping from poverty, what keeps them locked in poverty. And we had 2-hour sessions. They were facilitated. I had the pleasure of facilitating, and my job was to turn what people came to talk about into a conversation, into a discussion, not to have people make a series of presentations, but to really engage around what they knew about the nature of poverty in their community through the lens of the work that they did, and to have it turn into an exchange. And then the way we had it set up is we would have the key informants, the outside experts, the thought leaders, as we called them, various names, to first start just talking among themselves, while the staff, and this is sitting in a seminar sized room, and the staff in the community where the particular listening session was being held, sitting and listening for about the first 2/3, 3/4 of it. And then in the end, joining in with questions, with comments about their own work and how it related to it. And I'll say two things about this, the setting up of these, which I think say a lot that is worth noting, both about Legal Aid of West Virginia and also about West Virginia itself. We held these last August. It was August 21st was maybe the first one, something like that. Third week in August. And those of you who think back a year ago will know that About a month before was when you had the terrible flooding that wiped out bridges and roads, and dare I say, the director of the legal aid program's house, which she was dealing while this was all going on. She had water up to here because I happened to visit it and see where it was. So this was not just minor flooding; this was major. And I said to Adrienne, I said, I think we should really think about postponing this. People are going to be dealing with FEMA issues. They're going to be dealing with the fact they can't even get to work. You're going to be dealing with the fact that you're trying to rebuild your house and trying to organize, putting these together and going out and recruiting the kind of people I just described. That is, thought leaders in communities who are really willing to come and sit down and have a conversation, and finding those right people in the period, in about a month's period of time. Really, I just don't see how it's going to be done. And Adrienne, being Adrienne, said, "What do you mean we can't do it?" Of course we will. So I figured, well, okay. Well, we were looking to get 8 or so people, thought leaders at each of these sessions. We ended up with, what, an average of 15, maybe 18? 20 at each one. And I've done these in other places, in other parts of the country, and it's usually, frankly, a little bit of pulling teeth, because you're asking very busy people to give up 2 hours of their time and come down and sit and have a kind of an abstract conversation about poverty. But what was clear was, first of all, the commitment of the organization to make it work, but even more important to me and more telling was people were so anxious to sit down and talk about West Virginia poverty and what we can do about it. And really considered it an opportunity and a privilege to have that kind of a conversation and to really engage in it in a really serious way. Oop, just my little map. Oh, I've got to go back so you can see these communities show up here. So we did it in 7 parts of the state. Did it in 1 week because I'm from Colorado. Flew in, spent the week, and went to each of these communities. And as you can see, really tried to hit the diversity of what West Virginia represents: coal country in the south, Charleston, Huntington, with all of its particular features, and up here in the northern part of the state, and then way out in Martinsburg, which is, feels itself and is treated as a suburb of Washington, which has its own issues, right? Because it's still West Virginia. Wages are still the same among school teachers, et cetera, but it's right there next to some, much more affluent areas that affect how they operate. Just to kind of give you a sense of the connection between the community listening and the planning process. I've already described this, which is the community listening piece, and how that operated. And the next step was then to say, it's great to go and talk to people about what are the problems that affect you, but people don't talk about their problems as legal problems, right? They may. Some might say, I'm being sued by somebody because I didn't pay a bill, or I'm being evicted. But when you ask people to say, what are the problems that affect people, they're going to talk about opioids, right? They're going to talk about the destruction of the coal industry, a whole set of things that are where the legal issues that are embedded in that are not apparent. And so the next step, which was key, was the staff spending 3-4, how many months was it? 4 months probably?
4 to 5 months.
In a process. I mean, this is while they're representing clients, so they weren't meeting every day for 4 months. They were really fitting this into very busy schedules. But to do what lawyers do best, which is to say, here's a problem that has come to me from my client group. A bank doesn't go to their attorneys and say, we have this specific regulation we want to challenge. They go and say, there's this regulation, it's creating havoc with the way we deal with our clients. It's affecting the way we can market. And then the lawyer sits down and figures out, well, what are the legal issues that are in this? What can I as a lawyer do to help you in resolving that, responding to that? And that's what the staff did for 3 months, is talked about and thought about the issues they'd heard about and said, what is it that a lawyer can, not even yet, what could we do, but what could a lawyer do, an advocate do, to try to respond to these issues? And then that then led into the strategic planning, which was to make choices, right, about what could be done. Because if you come up with a long list of things that might respond to the entire range of issues that affect West Virginia, and the things that an advocacy organization, a law firm for the poor might take on, the list is going to be massively longer than Legal Aid of West Virginia could tackle. It's a organization that, as every legal aid organization in the country, is woefully, radically underfunded. I was thinking this morning when I woke up, I was thinking, you know, it's sort of like, legal aid is kind of like Noah's Ark, right? You know, we all know the Noah's Ark story. We think, isn't it wonderful, the animals 2 by 2 and, you know, every creature on the planet. We never talk about all those animals that didn't get on the ark, right? They all drowned. Right? I mean, think about it. What happened to all those animals? Well, it's sort of a grim picture, but the truth is, it's a little bit what legal aid faces, right? The number of people that they can help are the animals 2 by 2. Fortunately, legal aid does some things that NOAA didn't do, which is they try to figure out ways for people to help themselves. They have lots of life preservers they throw overboard to help people do stuff. They train people through websites, et cetera, to help themselves. But the number of people that they're able to help compared to the need that is out here is not quite as bad as NOAA faced, but it's somewhere on that scale. So I want to talk just sort of broadly about the kinds of issues that a way to sort of break down the sorts of things that we heard, and then I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the specifics and let you sort of hear what some of the, or read, what some of the people who came to these committee and listening sessions said about the problems. But as we sort of analyze this in preparation for the staff sitting down and going through the process I just described, what we recognized was some of the issues that people raise really go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? They were pure survival questions. They were, do you have any income to take care of yourself and your family? Do you have shelter? Literally a place to live. And then there's a whole set of things which were related to that are, one might say, not necessarily basic necessities, though they directly connect to capacity to have those necessities, and there were things like transportation. And the lack of transportation. Childcare. You know, the lack of childcare if you're a single woman raising children, and the percentage of low-income West Virginians who are women who are raising children alone is very high. I don't know what the percentages are, what, 60, 70, 80%, I'm guessing it is in most places. So lack of childcare might seem like an amenity, but in truth, it directly connects to capacity to get a job and keep a job. And then a number of things we heard were sort of, I mean, they also probably connect to Maslow's hierarchy of needs because they have to do with literally survival. But things which threaten people's well-being, drugs was a huge one, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Domestic violence is a problem that's been with our, you know, a part of our communities for decades, for centuries probably, and we just recently have really begun to understand the devastating impact of it. There's a lot of efforts to respond to that, but it's obviously by definition a direct threat to survival and well-being. And then what we heard, and I want to talk about this in a minute as well, one of the things that came out of these community listening sessions was they turned in not just to, here's a set of broad problems which may not have a clear legal dimension to them, but we're going to work with that. They also became this sort of real window into the nature of poverty and the, you know, generate those, some of you may have read, you know, so people write about poverty, they talk about generational and situational poverty, and it was such a compelling sort of insight into that, because West Virginia, in ways that I'm going to talk about in a minute, is such a place which really reflects so much historic challenge of issues related to that. And then a set of as people talked among themselves, these were all folks who work with low-income people, right? And some were teachers, some ran domestic violence shelters, some were politicians. There were various sorts of people, but what became clear in the conversation was people would say it among themselves, we don't do enough to work together to sort of connect our services and to make certain that we have a holistic way to respond to people's needs. So some of the things which came out of it were those sort of broad institutional questions. And then, of course, we heard about specific problems with lots of populations, older folks, children, foster kids, et cetera. And that's sort of all that takes place sort of interwoven among the sort of broader spectrum of problems that people face. Sort of thinking about, so what do you do about it? The thing sort of came out of that as well, and some of you who are law students and thinking about what you might want to do, whether you're working pro bono, some project that you're working with Legal Aid of West Virginia, or if you're lucky enough to work there. These are the sorts of things that will be on the list of what can be done to respond to the range of problems. And some of them are, the work that they do now, and this planning has sort of led to this, the work that they do now, some of what happens when you sit down and really sort of get an understanding of the deep underlying problems that face low-income folks, is you have a different sense about how the eviction work you do relates to the larger housing problem question. It's not just you're helping your client not get evicted or avoid an order that's going to land on their life in 3 weeks, but it also relates to the broader question of housing problems. And some, when you're talking about these deep, big problems, sometimes it gets a little bit overwhelming because you think, what can we do? Well, as we talked about, one of the things that's clear, sometimes it's very simple things. People getting a job. If you don't have a driver's license, you can't get a job because you can't get to work. So for some people who have some impediment to getting a driver's license, they've got some order outstanding that prevents it because of the operation of the law, or they had some traffic violation that simply a high volume way of getting people to be able to get their driver's license can make a big difference. And some involve just what, sort of full representation is a term of art in the legal aid world. It means representing an individual client about an issue, but going to court with them, doing from soup to nuts, not just giving them a self-help remedy, but they can be very simple and fairly straightforward kinds of cases. And then some of the responses do involve really trying to do some broad-based advocacy. The last session that I sat in on with some folks here had to do with kind of racial inequity in West Virginia. And one of the things that the criminal lawyer who does a lot of work here spoke about was the incredible disparity between the number of African Americans and percentage of African Americans in West Virginia, which is like 3%. And about, from the numbers he gave, about 60% of people in prison here are African American. Well, that's a disparity which is like knocks you off your feet, right? Well, that's the sort of thing that somebody might say, armed with that kind of information, we should be advocating to change that, to change sentencing process, et cetera. And so that kind of broad is not something that Legal Aid of West Virginia would necessarily do, because it involves the criminal world, but that is an example of broad-based advocacy to respond to a problem. And some of that's informal, right? Some of that is just being able to be at the table as people are talking about things, as governmental agencies wrestle with the opioid crisis. One of the things about legal aid organizations here, certainly, and it's been my experience across the country, is quite often legal aid organizations are the entities that are the most connected to these problems because they have boots on the ground. They're working with clients and people every day that convey that's what's happening on the streets with people. And so as governmental agencies and policymakers make decisions, having someone who has that insight and understanding can be enormously beneficial. And so just having this sort of connection. In West Virginia is a small state and people know each other. And so because of that, the capacity to sort of know whom to talk to is something that's really readily available. And so that sort of informal kind of connection with people is much more accessible than it would be in New York or California or Ohio or some other more populous state. Economic development. You're going to hear a little bit about some work that's happening with that right now, because that's clearly one of the challenges for West Virginia on all kinds of fronts, and the capacity of legal aid to get engaged in that fits right in their wheelhouse. And then just also educating people, teaching people about their rights. And then this last piece, which is one of the things that was a characteristic of the community listening sessions, was the interconnections that were made among, people were invited to come and sit and spend 2 hours talking. There's 20 people, 7 times 20 is, somebody do the math, and it's a lot of people, right? A lot of organizations. And even in the sessions themselves, you could see this beginning to happen. People across the room who didn't know some work that someone else did and saying, hey, we should talk. I saw people exchanging cards, people making, you know, arrangements to have lunch, and similarly with legal aid, because the fact that it is Noah's Ark, probably the analog that's the closest is Dunkirk, right? I don't know how many you saw the movie, right? There's Noah's Ark out there trying to get animals 2 by 2, can't get them all on. So yeah, you know, Dunkirk is right. All the various boats and fishing boats, etc., from England went and rescued all the British troops that were trapped and about to be wiped out by the Nazi army. And all those little boats went out there and picked them up and saved 350,000 people. Pretty remarkable story. So partnerships. I knew you were going to write that down.
I've got Noah's Ark and Dunkirk.
And Dunkirk, man. It's like, who knew that the two were connected? So, just a couple of things about these, and then I just want to let you sort of hear for a minute about, you know, what we heard in these sessions about some of the issues that face this state and face low-income people and disenfranchised people. But I think, you know, there were 3 things that these sessions did. One was, in a very compelling way, providing information about the kinds of issues that face West Virginia. This was August 2017. Everybody in
16.
2016, was it 16?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right, 2016. God, it does fly. Wow. I guess we were having fun. This is August 2016, right? And at the time, everybody in the United States now knows about the opioid crisis, no matter what place you're in, they know about it. It's been declared a national emergency by the president. There's all sorts of places where people talk about it. People weren't talking about it in 2016 when we did this. We heard about it in such compelling, just emotional terms in these sessions, and that's what it did. It conveyed in a way that you could only get by sitting down and really hearing from people who were engaged in it about issues like that, about what the impact is of the loss of jobs in the coal world, what it means to not have adequate housing available almost anywhere, what it means not to have transportation where people can't get to work, they can't even get down the block to go to the doctor. And a lot of the people who came to these sessions, we asked agency people, right? We asked people who were running organizations, who worked in them. A lot of those folks were folks who came out of the very experience that we're describing. We were in Logan County in talking with coal people, and there were people working there who were working in agencies, and they were the sole breadwinner in a family that 5 years earlier had an income of $90,000 or $100,000 a year because they were coal workers, right? And they didn't have a job anymore. So now it was the wife, and you know, it's very gender-based because coal miners are men, who were talking with great pathos about what it meant to them to be working in a job at a social service agency, which they didn't mind doing, but their pay was nowhere close to $90,000. So this sort of impact of understanding the nature of these problems in a way which was, you just can't get from statistics, you can't get from reading a report. And then the second thing is what I said, which is, you know, in these sessions, in virtually every one, the people who were there expressed, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, that they never really got to sit down and talk about poverty. They never got to talk about the work that they do in the broader context of what's going on in West Virginia in terms of low-income families. And the sort of insights they gained, I mean, it certainly it was done for Legal Aid of West Virginia, but I think everyone who participated in it got this really a deeper sort of sense of how these things fit together and began to understand the interconnection among some of the issues in ways that they could begin to think about responding to them in a more holistic way. So this is where some of you in the back may want to stand up just to be able to see, because these are just a series of quotes, what people said in these sessions. And the first area was, you know, massive job loss. There's just the loss of coal as part of the economic base of West Virginia and the impact that that's had on families. And how hard it is for people to make the transition. Because coal mining families, as you all are from West Virginia, many of you may be from coal country. These are generational. People have been in the mines for
for generation after generation, and have that pulled away, it's obviously, the economic impact is terrific, but the capacity to respond is affected by it. And then this sort of broader problem of, you know, the impact on the nature of the population. The younger folks move out, they gotta go somewhere to get a job. Sometimes it's the man who goes off to Ohio and gets a job, leaves the family, the wife and kids here. And sometimes, and just a lot of ways that shows up. This middle quote, I just wanna pause and have you look at it, because one of the things that came through to me, and it's reflected in, or it's a reflection of what I said a few minutes ago about how not long after the flooding, people, you know, even though they were dealing with all sorts of issues related to that, they showed up at these sessions because this real desire to talk about things and how to make it work, and this observation of you know, that we've already got, and there's a lot of grit here. This is just sort of one of the things that came through to me as somebody who's not from West Virginia. I grew up in, you know, in Colorado, and I've worked all over the country and worked in the deep South a lot, but I'm not from there. And so to really hear and get this sense of, you know, we really intend to fix things. You know, we know we've got a lot of problems. We know we're at the bottom of a lot of statistical lists about, you know, jobs and one thing and another, but we really intend to make a difference about it. So this is a problem that's lack of safe and affordable housing. There's no part of this country that's not top of the list of what affects low-income people. We've divested massively as a country in housing for low-income people. The markets in some places, the cost of housing just continues to skyrocket. What was interesting and came through in these sessions was the fact that even though the economy is depressed in West Virginia, housing costs have not come down, particularly the fact that, and that there's just, you know, there ain't housing, and what there is expensive and is often pretty terrible. And then this sort of interesting thing that we heard too, you know, that there's these things are interconnected, but some people reported a number of homeless people they saw who were in their 70s and 80s, you know, folks with dementia who were homeless or in homeless shelters. Well, being sort of close to that myself, I can imagine how rough that would be, you know. So. And then, of course, domestic violence. There's lots of women who are victims of domestic violence, and they're protecting themselves and their kids. And they end up leaving the abuser, and there ain't no place to go because there's not a lot of housing, and shelters are completely overwhelmed. And so there's a lot of folks who are on the street who are families that end up as a result of domestic violence. This one, you know, drugs. I know I spoke to this before, that just hearing in 2016 about something that was so graphic and powerful before it was even on the radar of anybody but folks who sort of saw it every day in the work they were doing. And the impact of it, not just on, you know, those individuals who are addicted and the people who overdose, but the impact on their families. We heard, you know, people talking about that there's whole parts of our community where there's no, you know, it's the grandparents that are taking care of kids, only there's some places where the grandparents are addicted as well. So the sort of impact on the family structure was just really astonishing. And then this sort of sense of, you know, this is a problem we face now as a country, and West Virginia faces in a massive way. But the impact of it is going to, you know, once it gets solved, if it does, is going to extend to the next several generations, both because of the lack of parenting that's going on, but because of what this, because the sort of impact on children's development and what happens with them because of the loss of the sort of capacity to for kids to, or parents to parent. And then the sort of interconnection with employment, right? That some people are, you know, when people, particularly in coal country, are wrestling with such dislocation. And so the tendency or the attractiveness of drugs, even apart from the fact that it's being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry, which we also heard about. I mean, there were a lot of people who were frankly just, pardon my French, pissed off, right? that sort of seeing, you know, how West Virginia, among a lot of other rural states, has just been victimized by the pharmaceutical industry. We heard a story in the last session I was in about, you know, somebody who's a dentist whose income, half of his income was spent on giving prescription drugs to people and getting them addicted to, and at like $600,000, $800,000. This wasn't some minor thing among his friends. And then we all know, you know, what's happened in terms of you know, the pharmaceutical industry sending so many more drugs here than conceivably could be used. So these were the two things that were suddenly the sort of what came out of these sessions was this real understanding, at least for me, and I think it was true for most of the people that participated in it, that when we talk about generational poverty and situational poverty, they're not abstract terms by some sociologists. They really describe something that it's important to understand. And this is one of the things that this generational poverty is much less likely that you can't sit down and say, all right, we're going to figure out how to, you know, to file a lawsuit to enjoin generational poverty, right? It ain't going to happen. But if you're an organization that works with low-income people, understanding the culture people come from and how it affects they interact with you as an advocate is really important. And the two kinds of poverty we heard about were generational and situational. I want to just touch on the difference because in the context of what I just said, in terms of how you work with clients who come from an experience of generational poverty versus situational, is pretty important. And this is just, I mean, this last quote here was really telling. You know, one of the people who participated in this was a school teacher, and she said, you know, I did a session with my kids. I think he was an elementary school teacher. She said, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's just something elementary school teachers do, right? And she said, one of the kids said this, you know, I want to grow up and sit on the porch and drink beer with my dad. Well, it's sort of, when you hear it, sort of makes you smile, and it's kind of a cute sort of notion, but sort of embedded in that is this sort of sense of being locked in place that is why she, you know, why she raised it. And then this sort of, you know, this kind of what people talk about West Virginia fatalism. You know, there's a certain, I mean, there is what I said, we got to rely on ourselves, and we got the grit to do it, and that's really important to sort of understand and know that it's a part of the community here. But there is also this, well, you know, things are just going to land on my head, you know, and I'm going to have things happen to me. And then this last one, you know, that, which is both true of situational in a different way and generational, and it's something that people have more and more have begun to understand, and that is that people who grow up in a generational poverty, where they just learn to cope, and they don't ever expect to get out of the circumstance that they're in, that it affects children's brains when they're developing, and so you end up with behavior patterns and with capacities to function which are a product of that. And it's physiological. It's not a judgment about people. It's just saying that any human being that exists in certain circumstances that really threatens them in a traumatic way is going to have an impact on brain development when they're a child. And situational poverty, the difference with situational poverty is what happens when people ain't been poor, and all of a sudden they have a major health crisis. They lose their job. They have a family crisis. You know, family breaks up completely, and there's mom suddenly on the street with the kids. And that happens a lot, as we know, in our country. So somebody who's just not used to making it, doesn't know the ropes, doesn't know who to talk to, doesn't know what the system is like, and suddenly is out there. And that what happens, and this is something that is, you know, in terms of working with folks who are low income and are in a place of situational poverty, and this is true whether you're a legal aid program or a social service agency, or you end up being private, those of you who are students end up being a private lawyer doing a pro bono case with someone. But the challenge of it is that people who are in that circumstance, that people have begun to recognize more and more that it's like PTSD. They're traumatized in much the same way. And one of the things that people who work with PTSD have learned and know is that when you take a soldier who's been through something which has caused PTSD, when you ask her or him to sort of talk about it, it re-traumatizes them, they relive it. But as lawyers, you know, if you're representing a woman who's a victim of domestic violence, you have to know the facts, you gotta know what happened with it. So, but the mere process of engaging with what happened with you and tell me about it, if not done, excuse me, if not done with a huge amount of sensitivity, can be re-traumatizing in a way that will, you know, and if you're asking the person to make some choices or to come back and talk to you again, it's going to get in the way of that, number one. And number two, the fact that a lot of folks who are in situational poverty are paralyzed by their circumstances. They're literally just paralyzed. I actually did some work in California with and the people there talked about, you know, if you're poor, it's like living in quicksand. The example that someone said here was, it's like living in amber. And this is one where the, you know, affecting brain development. One of the interesting things that sort of came together in these conversations was that people talked about what someone described as the rising epidemic of behavior problems. That this is an educator and just seeing a difference in the way that children 3 to 5 or, you know, 3 is preschool, right? 5 is what, first grade. That the sort of behavior problems were just demonstrably different. And you know, as we sort of talked about it, this sort of recognition that this kind of the trauma and the impact on brain development and sort of how you can function was showing up in the schools in that way. All right, so you know, one thing that became clear was the problem with poverty is poverty, right? You don't have money. I mean, all these things are sort of symptoms of it, but the reality is there isn't money. And a lot of people just talked about that. You know, we need to be thinking about how we deal with poverty from the perspective of living wages and taking care of people's needs and having a capacity to function. This was fascinating, right? Which was the educational challenge. As I said, we had a number of people from the education world, not a huge number, but some. And one of the things we learned was that a challenge is that there's just a devaluing of education among many of the populations. In coal country, where people that earn $90,000 a year have 2 trucks and a great house and you know, and live well, right? They didn't need an education. They knew they were going to go to the mines. They were going to work in the mines, and so they just didn't think about, you know, sort of working to develop an education. There's no criticism of anybody. It's just a natural result of that, of the culture. So that now we have a problem where you have a number of people who need to find new work. They need to be reemployed in a variety of ways, but it's not just there's not an educational base for it, but there's not a value, this is what we heard, among lots of families toward education. And so some of the issues, how do you sort of affect that and respond to that? Transportation, wow. I've done a lot of work in all parts of the country with kind of what affects low-income people, and from Silicon Valley to Detroit to here to central and western Massachusetts, and transportation, the lack of transportation is such a core issue for virtually all these areas because of what I sort of said before. You can't get to work, you can't get to health care, you can't get your kids to school, you can't get to daycare, and the impact of that on being able to get out of poverty is enormous. And there's huge issues associated with it, obviously, in terms of policy making, et cetera. So there were other areas that I'm not going to talk about now, and we're going to as much, but just, you know, we heard a number of things, and this is the list. You know, lack of medical and dental care. And lack of dental care is a big issue. You know, we sort of think of healthcare as being an important thing, but for a lot of people, you know, dental care is directly connected to a whole set of other issues. Already talked about child care and domestic violence, criminal records. West Virginia has a terrible statute on it's very difficult to expunge criminal records. I don't know if it's changed. I think there was something pending, but
I'm
gonna talk
ameliorated.
Good,
I'm gonna talk
excellent.
about
I'm setting up the next
Just
speaker.
wait.
We're so coordinated. And also illiteracy, and it's just, you know, lots of people just don't know how to read. And if you're an adult and you don't know how to read and you don't want anybody to know it, it's an incredible impediment. Lack of food. Some people said we have 1 store in our county. Others said we have none, 0. Not a store to be found in the county in which we live. So yeah, the sort of impact of lack of nutritional food, paying massively more, eating what you can get from 7-Elevens, which is typically processed food, which is not healthy and very expensive and not good for kids growing up. So this could be, if we stop now, we'd all probably go out and say, let's go to the bar and get drunk. I can't stand it, don't tell me anymore. It's more than I can hear. The good news is, right, this ends with a set of conversations about folks who did what this was about, which is, all right, let's be serious about the kind of problems that affect low-income communities. But then let's take it that middle step and say, what can be done by smart advocates who care? And then the last question is, what can we do? And that's the strategic plan piece. So.
It's easy to be paralyzed, right? We talked about individuals being paralyzed. It's easy to get all of this feedback and say, we're too small, we can't do it. So Adrienne's going to talk about how.
You can nod at me when you want me to guess what the next slide relates to what you're going to talk about. We have this thing we've done psychically between Colorado and...
I think I've only got 2 slides, John, so it
Well, I know.
should
I
be
didn't want
fairly
to clutter up or
easy.
challenge either.
So, I really have to thank John again. Walking us through the comments and the process was sort of a mini reliving of it. And it really was a profound process to be in all these different communities and listening in a different way than we typically do. And I find it, again, just fascinating to go through the information that we heard from the people that we talked with. So my role today in the program is to do what I do in everyday life, which is to be a bridge from the listening and the thinking to action. And so you all have, Marjorie has described and John has described this very organized and very intentional process where we were thinking and listening and thinking. And we took all this powerful information and then we overlaid the questions of what do we as an organization want to do and why. And so that was so much of the valuable work of what this process led to. We were asking questions about what are we already doing that relates to the problems that were identified. Are we going to repurpose this work? Are we going to redirect it in some way? Are we going to stop doing it? Particularly that third question there, is it more compelling than our current work? John has talked about the limited resources we have available, so all of these imply a very direct set of choices that we can and hope to make. Do we have or need to get the skills to engage staff, draw on or create new partnerships, and particularly attract new funds to the work? We also, this is not a strategic planning seminar, so I'm not going to launch into strategic planning area 5, goal 3, objective 2, action plan 1. That's not the intent, but I do want to talk about the product that we ended up with, the strategic plan, so that you understand how all of this worked together. But before I get there, I do want to give you some context for legal aid as an organization. As I look around the room, we have some staff people in the room. We have Marjorie as our board member, Bob Bastris, and Professor Bastris in the back has worked with legal aid programs for years, but many of you may not have a sense of the organization. So I felt like it was important to give you a snapshot. We are the state's largest nonprofit law firm. We have 140 staff spread between 16 different locations around the state. And of those 140 staff members, about 58 of them are lawyers. So we're, as I said, a good-sized law firm. We have a budget of about $10.2 million, and that comes from federal, state, service contracts, private donations, foundations, a whole mix of different funding. We've got more than 26 different funding sources. We handle about 12,000 cases a year, providing a variety of levels of service. And the organization that we're talking about, Legal Aid of West Virginia, I have to give a bow to our heritage. Most of you in the room are young, so these names may not mean anything to you, but we came out of 4 legal aid organizations rooted in West Virginia history: Legal Aid of Charleston, Appalachian Research and Defense Fund, Legal Services Plan, and North Central Legal Aid. So we are the statewide civil legal services organization in the state, and all of the work that we're talking about is feeding into this large organization. It means that we are managing a lot of people, doing work in a lot of locations via a variety of funding sources, and a real array of services for clients. Now, as I think Marjorie or John alluded to, this is not our first rodeo in terms of strategic planning. We have that as a value in the program, that we think strategically about the work that we're going to do, and that it helps guide us in making choices about how we spend our money, how we spend our time, and where we put our energy. I think the difference this time was the approach, as we've outlined here. The community listening sessions really gave us a whole different core on which to base our strategic planning process. And it helped us to really focus on the piece that we felt was probably most lacking in our former strategic plans, which is on that strategic advocacy piece. And so that's why the community listening sessions have been so important in terms of feeding information and energy and engagement by community folks, as well as investment by staff in that process. As a result, we have created this plan that is, I think, both realistic but aspirational. It runs for 3 years with a particular emphasis in 3 different areas: creating or responding to emerging legal issues, creating innovative partnerships, and you'll hear a little bit about what some of those partnerships are, and then better using technology for communication and problem solving both inside the organization as well as outside the organization. I do want to tell you that, again, this is not a strategic planning seminar, but I feel like I have to at least mention the 6 areas that we are targeting for real focus through this planning process. We came up with 6 strategic priority areas, 21 goals, all been assigned out to various folks in the organization to take action on, and then 41 objectives. So if you're a geek, you know that that exists in terms of our planning document. But the real focus is on improving access to services, delivering high quality, high impact client services, engaging client and stakeholder communities through outreach, education, and service collaboration. Sure. Ensuring a highly committed, highly qualified, well-supported, and unified legal aid staff. Planning for our long-term financial health and stability, and ensuring that we are well-governed and administered. So when we talk about the pieces or all of the activity that took place with the community listening sessions, but also a lot of data gathering among staff, we surveyed the bench and the bar, we held listening sessions or surveying sessions at Department of Health and Human Resources, a variety of other ways to gather and analyze data, and we created this document to really strategically focus what we are doing. So it is funny that John used, and if you are at all interested in seeing this amazing document, we have put the URL address up there and you all can see for yourself. I thought it was very funny that you used Noah's Ark and Dunkirk, because in my mind, there are boat analogies. I always think of our plan with regard to boats. And it's that getting everybody rowing in the same direction. When I talk about all the moving parts, diverse locations, many funding streams, lots of staff, I mean, it is really a huge task, but one that is so important is to get everybody rowing in the same direction. We've also talked about turning the battleship. We have set up a plan that takes us in a certain direction that's extremely exciting, but we're an institution. We are, change is sometimes hard, and it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to turn that battleship. Those are my two boat analogies that I think of.
I think it's all the rain that's been happening.
I'm adding Noah's Ark and
Can't we get out
Dunkirk.
of here without a boat?
So far so good. I've gotten really excited about where we are with this, and the way that I most measure that is not from my little pieces of paper where I mark off and color code who's doing what and we've had a success, but I work out of our Charleston office, and in the last month have had the pleasure of traveling to our Parkersburg office, our Wheeling office, and our Huntington office. And for me, the real proof in the pudding is when I talk with the secretary or the legal assistant in our Parkersburg office, and she's talking with me about the work that she is doing to meet some of the outreach goals in the strategic plan. When I talk with a new advocate, a new lawyer in our program, and I hear that they are working on personally aligning their goals as a new staff member to the goals of the strategic plan, it's really exciting, because it means that folks are starting to row in the same direction. And it really feels like this is not going to be that book that sits on the shelf, but it really is going to be a living document that means that we're not only all rowing in the same direction, but that we're really having an impact in the way that we want it in the client communities. Now we have 3 folks here who are going to do a quick presentation to describe to you how we are translating what we heard in the listening sessions to actual work. And wait, John, go back to that other, go back to that one before. Okay, so this is one of the strategic priority areas. This is kind of how we organize the plan. And this specific goal talks about focusing intake, advocacy, and outreach efforts in this large statewide organization across all the funding that we get to address critical systemic issues that came out of these listening sessions. And you can see that we have targeted particularly barriers to economic opportunity and the impact of the drug epidemic on families. So we have 2 of our best leaders, Elizabeth and Kate, who are going to talk a little bit about the work within the program. And then Kat Garvey here at the law school is going to talk about a partnership that we have with WVU that is focusing on the same. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
So now we're going to get off the boat and the rubber's going to hit the road. So how do we do this? How do we start to do the things that John and Adrienne talked about, moving from hearing what the folks in the listening sessions reported to us to actually responding to these communities and beginning to address these issues. And as Adrienne indicated, one thing that we started with was really kind of taking a broad look at what are we already doing in these areas and how can we do it better? How can we fine tune it? How can we be more intentional about it? So with regards to the opioid crisis, I think we've been real focused in a couple of areas. One was that we have historically a significant amount of funding and a lot of focus and longstanding partnerships working on domestic violence issues, and that stems from the fact that West Virginia is a state on all kinds of statistical measures related to cases and social science that has a high incidence of domestic violence. Well, come to find out, we sent out a survey to our attorneys who do domestic violence and said, you know, what percentage of the caseload that you are currently handling involves cases that are opioid impacted? And I don't know if people want to take a guess, but it was 80%. 80% of the domestic violence cases coming in the door through our partners involve opioid issues. And of that group, the stats varied a little, but generally it was in the range of 60 to 70% were cases where the allegations were against the perpetrator having a drug issue, but then there was some number, around 10%, where it was our client who had the drug issue or was being alleged had the drug issue, and then there were some instances where it was both parents. So we had,
you know, that group that we knew and that we learned, I think, I shouldn't have been surprised, but to my surprise, that we're really engaged already with this work. Another area where we're already working, we've had a long partnership with the Department of Health and Human Resources, who send us clients who need assistance to achieve safety and stability. Okay, again, once again, this may be a little bit of a stereotype buster, because again, I should know, having worked for 20-some years, but it was surprising to me. I think I still carry around that same picture of the welfare recipient that I started out in clinic as a law student, and when I first started at Legal Aid, and it's the mom with a couple kids and she's had a bad situation. No, that little boy is the typical welfare recipient, standing all by himself. The typical welfare recipient in the state of West Virginia is what is called a child-only case. And that's a case where there is a child living with no biological parent in the home who carries with them a benefits check that is then given to the caretaker relatives who are taking care of him. 65, 68%, depending on the last couple of years, of the West Virginia caseload is that kid. So we needed to train our staff better. We needed to bring in partners who work with these groups. We needed to bring in people who knew these issues and really try to focus and fine-tune the work we were already doing. So we were doing it in a more educated way. We were doing it with an awareness. And we were also doing it with a sense of the holistic range of the issues that this spills across. Particularly in working with the caretaker relatives, it's brought us into connection with some new partners, a group called Grand Families, who are doing some awesome work in the southern part of the state through an extension grant. And they work with caretaker relatives. It's intensely supported by social work, so we can really get more bang for our buck, and that the legal work we do and the legal advice we provide and the legal training we provide can be deployed to folks who have those social work resources to help them create a very stable situation for these little kids. We have been trying to partner up and work smarter with groups that are engaged in the work and trying to do more training around these issues. We've also tried to be creative in the last couple of years since the strategic plan got rolling about, and since we heard all this during the listening projects, about how we can increase our resources to work on these issues, because not every caretaker relative, who's working with a child gets a TANF check. And not every family has a domestic violence situation, so we know there are other folks out there who we wanted to be able to have specialist resources to serve. That's been a wonderful opportunity through a long-standing law school partnership. We have two amazing flippies who are sitting back there in the row, and they are Courtney Crowder and Katie Markham are our flippies, and they are working on kinship issues on a postgraduate fellowship from WVU, and have just been doing amazing work with the Grand Families groups. They have a 40-some page guide booklet that they put together for Grand Families. They're working on web materials. They're working on FAQs. They're going to do kind of a warm line where people can call from all over the state and get coaching about some of these issues and questions. And we've also, through their presence, started to build out the holistic services, because it's not just a guardianship case or an adoption case that these families need to, kind of work their way through. They need to understand the public benefits consequences that flow from each of the permanency options, from the note on the napkin, you take care of Johnny, to full-scale adoption. What money can you get from what sources as a result of that? If grandpa was a veteran, can grandpa adopt the child and the child get a veteran's check? If somebody's got a Social Security check, is adoption a better option? Are there family dynamics that make guardianship the better option? There are tax consequences. Heartbreakingly, one of the other issues that we've heard consistently that's a very real legal issue for these families is, under West Virginia law, how can I ensure that when I, the grandmother with, you know, stage 3 cancer, who's taking care of these 2 little kids, when I die, how can I make sure they're safe? Not easy under West Virginia law. There aren't a lot of great vehicles to do that, but there are some things you can do, and we advise people about them. So that's kind of how we've dived into this issue. We've tried to, you know, understand where we were already providing the services, get caught up to it, train, focus, and then really develop some specific resources. This summer we have 2 Legal Services Corporation Rural Corps students that we got awarded, and they are going to be also focusing on kinship issues in 2 other parts of the state that Courtney and Katie are not working in, but Courtney and Katie are going to be their digital mentors, and are going to be kind of shining examples of young attorneys launching a public interest career, which I think is very cool, in addition to spreading out the capacity with the work. So I think now we're going to turn over to Kate to talk about employment obstacles.
Hi everyone. Something that continually has come up over yesterday and today is the issue of employability. And I think that from the community listening sessions, one of the big takeaways is that in West Virginia, we obviously have an issue with availability for work. Are there jobs in certain places of the state? And that's an issue. But another thing that came up, and it came up in so many of the areas that John referenced, is that's not it. That's not the only problem for low-income families in getting into work and staying in work. They face a lot of other barriers. And so some of the things that we've taken from the community listening sessions is thinking differently about the issue of housing and eviction. And if you don't have a home or a place to live, it's really difficult to go get a job or to stay in a job. And so thinking through those barriers and thinking how we as a law firm can handle those, remove those for people so that they can get jobs and get into work. The issues that really came up that, you know, some are easier to think of, lack of childcare. Of course, that's an issue. But like I said, housing, the lack of education. You know, for a lot of people who have been trained in one area, it's really scary to think about going in a different area. But some programs, like the TANF program, West Virginia Works, have opportunities for training, keeping people in those programs so that they can get the education to try to find another type of work. Lack of transportation. What can we as lawyers do to get people in cars? That's hard. That's a really challenging thing to think about. But let's say, could we get to someone before their car gets repossessed? You know, could we work to try to negotiate a payment plan for them? Or is bankruptcy the right option? Can they afford to keep the car and get the payments down? Criminal records. You know, as has been alluded, our expungement law in West Virginia is very, very restrictive. Felonies? No, they're out, except the governor can pardon, and there's a few exclusions to that. So misdemeanors, between the ages that they were committed between the ages of 18 and 26. So you have to have been younger. And there are a host of other exclusions to that. So for a lot of people, that is a barrier. Everybody on an employment application now asks, you know, do you have a felony, do you have a misdemeanor? I'll talk a little bit about the law that is starting to change some of that, but that's a real issue. And then obviously the substance abuse, you know, drug testing. For a lot of jobs now, there's drug testing. And, you know, what is our role as lawyers in that and trying to get people into treatment, into ways that can help them? Kind of in tackling all this issue of barriers and getting people into employment, I think some of the challenges we've been thinking through and how to try to remove these barriers are, there's 3 of them, basically. As Marjorie mentioned, you know, legal services, we get people calling us every day about every legal issue you can possibly think of. And so we're answering hundreds of calls a day. We have tended often to be reactive. You know, the person calls us when they realize they're going to get evicted, and so we're dealing with that at the last minute and trying to keep them in the apartment for a couple weeks longer. Or they're getting ready to have their car repossessed, so we're telling them about what your options are for protecting that. But can we get to people earlier, before those things happen that kick them out of a job, that kick them into this spiral of a situation? And so that's something that we've been trying to think about. The other issue is not everyone identifies these issues as legal. one of our primary funders, Legal Services Corporation, did a study last year and spoke to low-income folks across the country and asked basically, have you experienced, one of these issues? And, majority had experienced a civil legal issue. Second question was, did you reach out for help? A lot less reached out for help. What was one of the reasons? They didn't identify lack of access to health care or an education issue or even an employment issue as legal. You know what they did identify as legal? A family law issue, because they know they're going in front of a judge to deal with it. Wills and estates were the two primary issues they identified as legal. So we don't always get people calling us saying, oh, hey, I've got this problem here, and if I lose my housing or I lose my car, it's going to make me lose my job. So, I think that's a challenge that we've got to work in the community to help people identify, wait a minute, a lawyer can actually help you with that. And the third challenge is, what type of legal intervention do we do? We're lawyers, we go to court, right? Direct representation, that's, one of the first things that come to our mind. But I think also that's not going to be an option for every case and every person. So what else can we do? Systemic advocacy. Can we work with our partners? Can we join groups and coalitions that are talking about these barriers to try to bring about some legislative change? We have some restrictions on what we can do around legislative change because of some of our funding, but we can work with partners to educate and let them know about the barriers that we're seeing our clients face to get into employment. So what do? How do we face those challenges and we get around them? So far, here are the few things that I think we have started on, and this is a process. We're not completely at the end yet, and so this is where we're going so far. I think one of the things I've seen the most excitement about in our program about this whole thing is focusing on collaborative, interdisciplinary collaboration and partnerships. We can't do this alone, and that's why I think this symposium has been really exciting. It's a lot of people coming together to think through. So a couple of things that we've been doing. We have a partnership at Mary C. Snow, which is a West Side elementary school in Charleston, West Virginia. It's in a neighborhood that is very, very low income. And a lot of the parents who are coming there are facing barriers to employment. It may not manifest itself that way originally when they come in, but for example, grandma came in, she's caring for a kinship issue. She came in, she's caring for a grandchild, and she's gonna get evicted. If she gets evicted, guess what? She's going to lose her job. So, dealing with those issues. Another one that came in is she'd been suspended from work. No one at work would tell her why. 2 weeks. No one from her office would call back to say why she'd been suspended. A lawyer picks up the phone to call her HR person. Guess what? Oops, we're sorry. That was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. She's back to work the next day. So some of these issues may not exactly at the front end present themselves as employment, but you can see the spiral of how they would impact somebody's ability to stay in their job. Some of the issues with the Community Economic Development Program that Kat's going to talk about are how to help people and individuals create jobs, but also some of those attorneys in the community economic development work are helping to remove barriers. So some of the work that they've been starting to do is talking with some of the drug treatment programs about, okay, you're working with someone, they're going through this process, they want to go out into the world and they want to try to gain employment. What can we do to try to help them and remove barriers? We've talked about partnering with community and technical colleges. So people are going through these programs. Are they ready once they get out to actually go out and find employment? So I think the partnership and the interdisciplinary aspect of it is really important. As lawyers, we can try to resolve the legal issue, but sometimes they need money too. And so, partnering with Catholic Charities to help pay for some fines for a driver's license or that kind of thing. The other thing I think that we're really excited about is targeted outreach and really trying to reach our partners and our clients and do more community education as a way to more proactively get to clients. So we've been doing presentations about the new law that John mentioned earlier, Second Chance Employment Act, that was passed last year in West Virginia. Basically, it deals with the issue of felonies in West Virginia, and if it's been 10 years, which is a really long time, since the conviction or you've gone through probation and everything, haven't had any other issues come up, you can apply to, it basically becomes a reduced misdemeanor, is what it's called. And so it's a new process. It's start. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to work on reducing that 10-year amount because, quite frankly, for most of the people we've talked to, that's a big barrier. They're just not at 10 years yet, and 10 years is a long time. But we've been doing outreach. We've worked with the Division of Rehab to do a presentation. We've put a ton of materials out there to let people know that this is available. It's something to watch for. It's something to keep in mind as you're moving forward. And I would say lastly, we've also gone to libraries and FRNs to talk about that as well. The last thing I think is that in terms of being more proactive in dealing with our clients, the other thing that we're trying to do is be more holistic. In an interview, when someone calls in about a family law issue, you ask more questions. Well, what else is going on? They call in about a custody case, and then you get to the fact that, oh, they can't get to work because they lost their license because of that criminal issue that they had. They can't pay the fine, and so you start asking more questions and then thinking through what can we do. And particularly like our housing task force is trying to think, how can we get to people before they get evicted? How can we get to them when they have these bad habitability conditions before it gets to the point where they're in trouble and they end up in court because they haven't paid their rent? And so I think a lot of our advocates are trying to think of how can we get to clients more before it becomes a real problem that spirals and that they're not able to stay in a job or even move toward economic stability. So turn it over to you.
I'll keep this brief. I know people are probably hungry. And Priya Baskaran's not here today. She did not have a voice. But I wanted to, I'll just talk briefly about some of the newer collaborations between the law school and legal aid. I know that there's been a good relationship with the law school and legal aid for years, but there are a couple new programs that have formalized the relationship that are really exciting. And I'll also talk about some ways that we're partnering with the university, and I hope some of these partnerships will also translate to some of legal aid's activities too. So I think that, and the two new partnerships I'll talk briefly about are the Entrepreneurship Clinic and the Land Use Clinic. And the Entrepreneurship Clinic is really doing a lot of small business assistance. And so whereas legal aid historically was representing individual clients, the Entrepreneurship Clinic is representing still individuals, but they're business owners, and they can represent nonprofits and take a little bit more of a systematic approach to some of that business support. And Priya is working with legal aid to support some of their staff throughout the state on how do we do business formation and legal issues related to supporting small businesses, how do we retain and attract business, and how do we get more people in the workforce. On the Land Use Clinic side, I feel like when you were talking about legal aid having this focus on immediate well-being and survival, we are the long-term folks. So we would not be helpful at all during the flood. We would not have, we wouldn't have a life raft or a boat or anything. We're probably trying to, we are literally doing watershed planning and flood recovery and, maybe trying to keep flooding from happening in certain communities in the first place. But that in itself makes it such a nice collaboration where if someone has an immediate problem, we know who to send clients to, and our clients are just very different. Our clients are municipal governments and mostly municipal governments and nonprofits working on the longer term strategies to reduce poverty. And so just as a couple of examples, we hear from our local government clients all the time that the opioid epidemic is a problem, and that's kind of a newer issue for land use lawyers, because we're typically thinking about transportation and water infrastructure. So as our local government clients have been telling us that they don't know how to address this from a local government perspective, not necessarily the treatment perspective or the issues that legal aid is addressing, they'll say things like, maybe we should do a DARE program in our school. And we have kind of a gut feeling, it doesn't seem like that's been very effective, but we don't want to tell a county commission, that's a stupid idea. And so we are just so lucky to be at a large university that has people that have a ton of expertise in this, and we know who those people are now. And so every time we get a question, I have 10 experts that I say, please do you have some statistics that show that this is a good idea or not a good idea. And typically, not only do they send me statistics, but they have 10 other suggestions for a better idea that I won't go into, but if anyone's interested, I can share those. And so I think some of that same type of data could be helpful. And I think there's already connections with criminology and some of those things, but there's some exciting new partnerships at the university level because there's an increased focus on applied scholarship, meaning that tenured professors who have historically worked on, like a form of amoeba that they are very interested in but has no impact to the state of West Virginia. There's a lot more pressure to say, there are a lot of problems in the state, and is there any way that you could direct your research to something that will benefit a problem that's already been identified? And so, for example, Everly College has one woman whose entire job is applied scholarship. What are you doing, and can I connect you to partners who have identified through listening sessions or through comprehensive planning issues? So it's also not WVU or even legal aid coming in to save the day on on a white horse, which most of the time we do a good job of that, but it's even better when it's already been something that's been identified by the community. And just a couple other quick examples. One on the affordable housing side, we're working with Community Works and FAHI, which are associations of nonprofit housing associations. So again, where legal aid represents the individual homeowner, we're representing the nonprofit housing agency itself to look for opportunities for redevelopment. Can we redevelop dilapidated buildings into affordable, quality, safe housing, and just get the cost of housing down so fewer people are evicted? But it's a little bit more systematic and takes a lot longer. And then I was excited to hear about the partnership with WVU Extension. I think that is a great opportunity for engaging at the local level. Our extension office has folks in every single county, and I have a new joint appointment with Extension. So, but I think I'll leave it at that, given the time. So, thanks.
Since most of our audience here is students, let me spend just a minute. You've heard a lot about how this law school has interacted with legal aid and with other agencies in the state to try to make this state better. And you've all got a role in doing that. Whether it's through working with legal aid, whether it's through pro bono activity, whether it's through state legislative advocacy, there are things that you can do to make this state better. And you should do them. Okay. So, on your way out, we have sugar, in case your blood sugar is falling dangerously low. And where are we in terms of time?
Right now.
Right now, okay.
I think amazingly precise.
Excellent.
Lunchtime.